As debates heat up over who gets to build and benefit from artificial intelligence, the question of openness is taking center stage. Conversations around access, ethics, and innovation are becoming more important. And one of the biggest questions at the heart of it all is, what does it really mean for AI to be open source? Gilbert, Igwe, an AI and data scientist who is passionate about building inclusive and responsible AI systems, will be unpacking the realities of open source AI with me. Let's dive into it. Now, Gilbert, when we talk about open source AI, what exactly do we mean? Some people conflate it with open weight models, but there seems to be more nuance. Can you break it down for us?
Yeah, pretty well. So when people say open source, really, they often conflate it with open weights or open code and open data. Now, open source ideally means that the model architecture, the model weights, the training data, and the code are all publicly available under a license that allow reuse, inspection, and modification. But in practice, that's what we have in actuality is that many models labeled as open source are mainly open weight. So you have Meta's Llama or Mistral. What they do is they release the final weights for inference and some data in the system guide for fine tuning, but not the data or training code. Now, the folks at DeepSeek, they've gone a little far ahead and shared the weights and the published paper on the model architecture and some training techniques, but not the exact training code or data. So you have training weights and a little bit of information about the model, but you don't have the architecture if you wanted to replicate this thing exactly, in your own space with the same data to get the same result. So that is the confusion, and it stems from a lack of unified standards, right? As of 2024, that's last year, over 70% of so-called open models on Hugging Face, which is a hub where you have a lot of these weights hosted, they only meet partial openness. So open source really means that everything is open out there. You can look at the architecture, you can look at the data, you can look at the model, you can replicate it and get exactly the same result, or because of the probabilistic nature of AI, very close result. But open weight is where you can go on a hub like Hugging Face and download what has been already pre-built and you can build on it. So what we have really in most of the cases is open weights.
Thank you, Gilbert, for breaking down that for us. But why do you think there's so much confusion around that concept of open source in AI, especially when you compare it to the traditional softwares? What should people, especially those outside of the tech bubble, what should they understand about the differences?
So the thing is this, right? Traditional open source in the traditional sense, where you have software like Linux and MySQL or MySQL, it's easy to audit. You can tell exactly what has happened, the process that when the builder went through to get it to where it is. You can fork it. Forking means you can download it and take a copy of it and build on it and customize it, and you can run it. It's pretty deterministic. Every time you download it, every time you open it, everything is the same, and it's modular. Now, AI, by contrast, is probabilistic, like I said earlier, and it's data-driven, and it's compute-intensive. So it makes it opaque, even when the code is open.
Now, one big concern, about this open source in AI is access not just to models, but, to the data behind them. Now, can we truly call something open if the data is trained and remains closed? How does restricted access to training data affect the transparency and even global participation?
So now it really cannot be called open if the data is closed, because AI again is data driven, right? You have this mathematical architecture that you build, right? Takes matrices and extracts relationships and data. Now, if you do not have the underlying data, which is the foundation of AI behavior, then openness becomes performative transparency. So if really there is a consensus to make it open, let me have the data. Let me see what you trained it on. Are there biases in the data, right? Because these are really important concepts, right? The bias that LM inherits, or the AI inherits from the data, that bias It also produces during inference. And I do believe that eventually you may have questions about that, and I'm happy to provide further answers because it's a critical component of the AI system itself, the bias that is inherent in the data.
Of course, I'm going to come back to that, but you're absolutely right about, having all the processes involved. So if people want to improve on them, for their projects, they get to see everything. But let's talk about values and ethics. How do open source principles in AI, tie into the broader push for responsible and ethical AI? This is a conversation that, a lot of people have been, having. Is openness automatically a step toward fairness, or are there pitfalls?
Now that's a really good question. Openness can promote fairness, but not automatically. Now, on the positive side, it allows peer review, right? I can see exactly what data you trained this on. I can see exactly the mathematical computations going on the back end. These are cornerstones of responsible AI, right? However, without inclusive data sets where we all come together to, look at the data and say, okay, there is some bias in this data. For example, let's take a hypothetical model trained by Meta, right? To identify fraudulent behavior, right? And I've had some Nigerians complain about this. That was trained on data that erroneously labels any IM, that's any, what you call it, that DM, right? Any DM from an account that is domiciled in Nigeria as potential fraud. Now, in that case, there will be a lot of false positives, right? Where people's account get wrongly flagged or for fraud just because there's been that systemic hypothesis built into the data. It's a bias that's built into the data about the character of an average Nigerian. You see, right? So if there is no inclusive data set curation, there is no diverse governance and bias audits, an open model can still replicate systemic harm, just more publicly.
But how do we balance, the openness needed for innovation, with the very real risks of misuse? Should there be like guardrails or maybe governance structures around open source AI releases?
Yes. I do believe that openness without guardrails is reckless. So we need a nuanced system of governance, not necessarily censorship, right? A governance in the sense, okay, just imagine it as having a genius at your beck and call, right? Both for good, like to improve business processes and automate your day-to-day, and also for evil. So the ideal balance I would recommend, right, would be digitally signing every model with a unique identity of the user. Say you went on, for example, Hugging Face, again, like I mentioned, a hub where you have these models, the model weights. And as you download the weights, right, there should be a unique identification of who you are. And I believe this will be possible soon with Sam Altman's Wald, the CEO of OpenAI, or co-founder of OpenAI rather. He's founded this. There is this company called Wald. It's a framework for human identity. And I also believe beyond that, it can also be a new framework that's built on the blockchain, right? Where, like I said, every single weight downloaded can be traced to an individual.
The AI journey is indeed a long and complex one, and we're also finding our paths, on that journey. But one quick question I want you to discuss, and I want you to discuss this as briefly as possible. Does open sourcing an AI model automatically reduce bias, or can it actually make bias more visible?
So open source can amplify bias. Now, again, it depends on the data, right? Now, if the data has inherent biases, then expect the model as open source, right? The more people that use it, the more people are exposed to the biases, and the more the biases are expanded. So that is why it's very important that the model itself be really, really open, like rightly open, not just open weights, right? So that we can see, we as Africans, now think about it from this perspective, right? Over the years, I'll say over the centuries, of course, I wasn't born then, but history tells us that there is a narrative that negatively paints a picture of an African, right, as low IQ, and in the case of Nigeria, as an average Nigerian being a scammer or being a fraudulently oriented, right? Now, some of these biases are built into the data. So we need access to these, to the model weights, and in addition to the weights, the architecture and the data, so we can see the stories that have been negatively told about us, that have been negatively built about us into these data sets, and we can improve them. And another way we can look at it is to take the whole story into our own hands. I mean, there's so much research work that's been done that we can collate our data, curate our own data, and begin to tell our story from an African perspective. Quite frankly, it's not rocket science. The math behind this is easy. It only takes time. It takes a lot of effort. It takes some money. But I think that the narrative should be Africa or Nigeria in this context, trying to build their own, curate their own data set, basically, to tell their own story and put a data set out there.
Well, it's been an interesting and insightful conversation with you, Gilbert Igwe, AI and data scientist. Thank you so much for joining us on Tech Trends.
Thank you.